So we're now at the point where we want to start coloring our black and white image in a non-destructive manner. I've opened up here a Photoshop file that I had on Blackboard of a past student example, and you can look at how this was done in a non-destructive manner. So over here in the layers panel, if I turn off all of these layers, you can see that we have the original black and white image on the bottom layer. All of this color was added through separate layers, and all of the layers were also renamed to be something that was relative to what it was on the layer. So let's go through those steps. I have my black and white image here. If I open up my history panel, you can see that I already had to change this to RGB. It was grayscale, and so I went over that in a past video. And now let's talk about how we're going to paint it. So for this first example, for this first project, we're not going to use selections. We're going to be painting, so you're going to deal with the different diameters of the brush, the different hardness of the brush, and also zooming in and zooming out. I mentioned in a past video that the zoom tool is the magnifying lens down here, and I can click and zoom into an area. I can also kind of make a selection with it, or click and drag, and it will zoom into an area. I had also mentioned that in the options bar you can switch this to be a zoom out tool, but there's also the keyboard shortcut, the Alt key, that will switch it to be the opposite of whatever it was. So I had it as a zoom in tool. I hold the Alt, it becomes a zoom out. But if in the options bar I had selected it to be a zoom out tool, I hold the Alt key down and that switches it to be a zoom in. I am going to leave it at the zoom in. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is to create a new layer because I don't want to paint on my background layer. And I'm going to go down to the very bottom of my layers panel and click on the icon that's create new layer, and I want to make sure I'm on that layer. And if I know what I'm going to paint already, I could go ahead and rename it. So let's call this one Sky. I'm going to just do a slow double click where it says layer 1, and that makes that text editable, and I'll call it Sky. In terms of the image that you use, I said there's no size restriction. That being said, you want to have an image that is large enough that you can zoom in. So that's what we're going to be doing for this practice, to be able to get the details, that you can zoom in, and it's not so pixelated that you can't tell what you're working with. So something like in maybe the tree examples I showed you from the earlier video tutorials would be too small. So you want to have something that's probably at least like 800 pixels or 1200 pixels or more to work for this exercise. So I'm going to take my paintbrush, and then I'm going to go down to my color picker, and I have the foreground color and the background color, and I want to set the foreground color. So I'm going to click on that, and the color picker opens up. The color picker works in two parts. I have a slider here. I can slide up and down to choose different hues, and then once I've found the area, like let's say I want to work in the blues, I get this range of blues going from light blue to black, dark blue, that I can choose from. So I have to, this is the second step, I choose a blue from here. If this is the one I like, I can click OK. Just to point out while we're here on the color picker, if you ever were working with two different colors, a foreground color and a background color, and you quickly wanted to switch them, you can just click on this double arrow and that switches which is which. Also, if you quickly want to get back to black and white, you can click on these little icons here, and they'll take you to black and white. Now I do have to pick my blue again. Alright, I'm just going to pick some kind of blue, and click OK. So now I have my paintbrush selected, and here in my options bar, I was doing something before. I want to make sure that this was up at 100% and my flow's at 100%. And now let's take a look at the brushes. So we have a choice of size, and I'm going to show you a keyboard shortcut of adjusting the size. So I'm going to start out, and this depends. Am I going to be painting something very small, like the details of the track, or something large, like the sky, and I would need a large brush. And if you're not sure how large 61 pixels is, if you move the brush out, you can see an example of how large that would be. So the hardness refers to the edge. So if I'm doing something like a small and I want to have an exact edge, a small area, or if I want to kind of blend the edge, I would adjust the hardness. So I'm not going to have any hardness for doing the sky. I want to have a soft edge. And then down here you can choose specifically different presets for brushes. But for right now we're just going to deal with these two. And I click on the icon up here again to close that up. And so now I'm going to scroll up here, and I actually need to zoom out a little bit. So I'm going to click on the Z to get my zoom tool, and then Alt to zoom out. So that's a good keyboard shortcut. There's another tool that if you're zoomed in you can use is the hand tool, and that's the keyboard shortcut, the space bar, and that kind of just moves things around so you can see different parts of your screen. And back to my paintbrush tool. So the other keyboard shortcut I wanted to tell you was about making the diameter of your brush smaller and larger. On your keyboard, the left and right square bracket keys, which are the keys on the right hand side right underneath the backspace and above the enter key, those will adjust the size of your brush, and I find them really useful. So the left one will make it smaller, the right one will make it larger. Okay, so I'm going to make some paint strokes. I'm going to paint in here at a very large brush up here, and then as I get into the more detailed areas I'll use my keyboard and I'll make it smaller. And when we first paint this over, because I'm painting at 100%, it's going to look definitely not like those end results that I showed you. It doesn't look like a watercolor. But what we're going to end up doing, and I'm just going to kind of do a quick outline here, we're going to end up doing is going over to our layers panel and lowering the opacity so that our layer panel and the opacity will act like a blending mode. So the opacity is the level of transparency. So I don't want this to be completely opaque because it's not going to look like a watercolor then. So I'm not going to go through all of this so you guys don't have to sit and watch me do all this painting. So now over here in my layers panel with this layer selected, it's important to make sure this is the one selected and not this one. I'm going to go up here to where it says opacity, and I'm going to lower that down to a point when the blue starts to act more like it's blending with the background. So this is the result that I want, where I can still see the clouds. I don't want it to look like this where it's just been painted right on top of. I want it to look like I've tinted the black and white. And now I could go back and keep painting and fixing it up. So you can see, because we're using it as a blending, the things, the colors, the edges, they don't have to be exactly perfect. And that's okay, because we'll do that once we start getting into selections. I'll just do another one. If you didn't want to use the little icon down here, you could, to create a new layer, you could also go up to Layer, New, Layer, and here it asks you, you can put the name in right away. So I'll call this one Track. Now you don't need to have a separate layer for every color, but I would like you to have at least 3 or 4 different layers that you're using for this project, and perhaps you've separated them out by colors or by objects, so all the trees on one layer, for example, depending on what you're working with. And this time, just to show you another way, I'm going to zoom way in on some of these parts of the track. Another way that you could do this, so again, I want to make sure that I am on the track layer, not on the sky layer, and I'm on the track layer. I'm going to take my paintbrush, I'm going to make it very small with my keyboard shortcut, and instead of painting in at 100%, this time I'm going to paint in at 50%. So this is another way that you can do it. You could paint in at a lower opacity. I didn't really want to paint in with this blue, so I'm going to open up my history panel and I'm going to undo those last steps and change my color. I don't know, I'll make this some sort of strange color that wouldn't exactly exist, so this is going to be some sort of hyperreality. So I've made it a red, and I still have my opacity of my brush at 50%, and so I would start painting it. So you can see you really need to be very, very zoomed in to be able to get the exact details for this project, to be able to just kind of color in little different parts. All right, so this is another way you could do it. Paint at lower opacity, even though I've painted at 50%, and if I wanted it lighter, I still could go to my layer and lower the opacity there. Personally, I think it's a little bit easier to paint at a higher opacity and lower it down. You have a little bit more control, but I'm going to leave that up to you guys. Okay, so that's all for this video. Have fun with the project.